As the beginning of the American Revolutionary War unfolded, it became clear that the American insurgents could not match the superior British army through sheer force. To keep the flame of the revolution alive, the patriots needed small victories to galvanize neutral colonists for support. But true military victories were difficult to attain with a sustained population of loyalists and agnostic colonists, and the increasingly totalitarian British response. Instead, the American revolutionaries benefited from triumphs that were psychological. This is the story of how superior propaganda and a tragedy led to a strengthened resistance among colonists, as well as perpetuated a continuous theme of racial antagonism. By the summer of 1777, colonial separatists were beginning to pose a significant headache to the British Empire. What would be known as the American Revolutionary War was entering its third year. Yet, though patriot morale had increased by small victories in battles at Trenton and Princeton, overall support for the revolution was largely lukewarm, as many colonists were still uncommitted. In the northern colonies, the British agreed upon a strategy in which Generals Howe and Burgoyne would bulldoze through the colonies from two directions. Burgoyne would descend from Lake Champlain in Quebec, and Howe would advance north from the mouth of the Hudson River in New York. They were to be aided by a third movement that went east from Lake Ontario by Officer Barry St. Leger. All three officers were to converge onto Albany and capture the city. This strategy was put in place to sever the patriotic New England colonies from the rest of the revolutionary movement. Once this was completed, the then Commander-in-Chief of the British Army, Sir William Howe, would take the rest of his army to Philadelphia to battle with the bulk of the Patriot forces. The plan seemed appropriate. However, weeks later, General Howe had decided to take up a new course. Instead of linking up first with Burgoyne, he made conquering Philadelphia the primary objective of his campaign, as he believed George Washington's retreating army was in a very vulnerable position that he had to capitalize on. This left Burgoyne as the predominant British force in upstate New York. Through the summer of 1777, the flamboyant Burgoyne descended from Lake Champlain in Quebec with an army of 8,000 soldiers, easily capturing Fort Ticonderoga, granting safe portage access from Lake Champlain. Eventually, the army disembarked from their ships, needing to portage through the thick forest of upstate New York. Although only 30 miles separated Lake Champlain from the Hudson River, the terrain proved to be cumbersome in its dense forestry and the sweltering summer heat. Even with the aid of Iroquois scouts, Burgoyne's army consumed much time and provisions in the upstate wilderness. On June 23, 1777, Burgoyne issued a proclamation demanding colonists side with the British or face the wrath of his Native American allies. It was meant to deter any revolutionary sentiment and bolster loyalist support. Native Americans were promised compensation for the capture of colonists who were being rebellious. However, scalping was condemned unless against fair opposition. The proclamation was bombastic and garnered ridicule from many colonial newsletters. As Burgoyne and his army continued their march towards Albany, a young woman was making her way up north to Fort Ticonderoga. Jane McCrea hoped to rejoin with her recently engaged fiancé, who served as an officer in Burgoyne's army. As McCrea traveled north, she lodged at fellow loyalist Sarah McNeil's home in Fort Edward. Fort Edward had been held by the Continental Army, but was abandoned when it became known that the British were marching down. The Continental Army retreated south to Saratoga, leaving settlers to fend for themselves. The British, as in much of their campaign, had used Iroquois scouts to traverse the land. These scouts, however, began conducting raids along the settlements of Fort Edward, one of which would lead to the end of Jane McCrea's life. On July 27, 1777, McCrea and McNeil were captured by a band of Wyandot Indians. McNeil was escorted to Burgoyne's camp. It was then that she identified McCrea's scalp carried by a Wyandot Indian. The news of McCrea's death spread, and mistrust for Native Americans grew in the British camp, as Burgoyne struggled to uncover the truth behind the incident. Initially, Burgoyne demanded the perpetrator come forth to be executed, but no Native Americans came forth. Burgoyne was then persuaded not to proceed with his inquest, for fear it would lead to an exodus of Native American allies. However, the fracturing of Native American and British relations had already worsened from the incident, and in the coming weeks, many Native Americans deserted the British. What truly happened to Jane McCrea has been contested. It was claimed that 2 Native Americans killed her when arguing about who would receive the reward. On the contrary, it was argued that McCrea was accidentally shot by revolutionaries and only scalped after she had already been dead. Proponents of this theory attest that her body, when found, demonstrated only a bullet wound. Either way, what truly happened did not matter, because the American revolutionaries knew what story to tell when they caught word of the incident. Although Native American raids were not uncommon for colonists who lived inland, McCrea's death caused a significant and unique furor among settlers. She was cast as the embodiment of white naivety and innocence, chaste and pure, contrasted with the barbarous and dark-skinned Native Americans. Depictions of her death further exaggerated this contrast, claiming that she had been blonde and killed in her wedding dress. Native Americans were decried as scalp-hunting mercenaries, and tales reported that McCrea's scalp was sold to a British officer. Stories embellishing her death and its circumstances proliferated in newspapers and taverns. Horatio Gates, the Continental general who had taken over command of the American resistance in the Saratoga campaign, caught word of the story and exchanged letters with Burgoyne regarding the incident. His letter, which abhorred the incident, was widely published for colonists to see. Now, even neutral settlers felt compelled to fight against the encroaching British army. Following the incident, the British went on to mount significant losses throughout the Saratoga campaign, as resistance continued to mount, accumulating in a colonial force of armed farmers and militiamen, numbering 15,000, which surrounded the British position. They were 50 kilometers from Albany. After the major Battle of Saratoga, Burgoyne penned up, surrendered his army of 7,000 men on October 17th. This was the largest American victory yet, and prompted France to publicly support the American Revolution. Though a small event in itself, the atrocity propaganda that enveloped McCrea's death marked a turning point in the revolution that saw neutral settlers mobilize to the revolutionary cause. Revolutionary propaganda was very sophisticated and entrenched in colonial infrastructure, with the majority of colonial newsletters being sympathetic to patriot causes. American hostilities between the Iroquois and other tribes allied with the British would continue throughout the Revolution. The Native Americans, treated as a monolith to the antithesis of the cultured European man, would suffer as Americans began to govern their new country. Depictions of McCrea's death became more and more widespread in the 19th century, following the Revolutionary War. This was in tandem with Manifest Destiny and westward expansion. McCrea's death now was not used as a call against the British, but rather had entered into the new phase of American mythology.